I'm going to read from Solace, which came out this year. Solace is set in Ireland at the end of the boom and in the first year or so of the recession, when it became clear that everything was falling apart. It's about in fact, three generations, how different generations deal with sudden change and with new and very taxing circumstances. And it's really a family story. It's not, I didn't set out to write about Ireland at all, and what was happening in the outside world was just turned out to sort of, in some way, echo what was happening in the family and vice versa. Mark Casey is my central character. He's a young man in his late 20s who is from a farming background but lives in the city and is making not a very good job of being an academic. And in this scene, Mark and his girlfriend Joanne have just become parents to a little girl, Aoife, which was a surprise. Well, as much of a surprise as it can be after 9 months, but the first part of the 9 months was a surprise. Joanne is a trainee solicitor, which during the boom in Ireland was regarded as a great job, but not anymore. She cried every night, for almost every last minute of the night, and she cried in the early morning and for a good part of the day. In theory, that was no surprise. That much they had been warned about. But the exhaustion and the drudgery and the fear of getting something horribly wrong, nobody had described any of that. Nobody had described the way everything would shrink to this pinprick. It all became about getting this unknowable being, this powerless and yet infinitely powerful little reptile, through the day and through the night, when day and night scarcely seemed divided. The hours seemed to stop passing, becoming just a wall of insomnia, and of the same actions repeated over and over, until all awareness of a world outside fell away, came to seem like a rumour they both remembered hearing, but which they never had the time, never a moment, to sit down and straighten out. Of course, they went into this world. Of course, they had to. Once or twice a day, one or the other of them went down the street and around the corner to the Centra, which sold milk and bread and nappies and formula at extortionate prices. But it was a 5-minute walk, and it passed in a daze of thought and confusion and absorption in whatever scene they had just left behind. What hour of screaming, what fragment of silence, what rash, what shiver, what colour of puke, and what the next hour would bring, what needed to be done, what needed to be guarded against. She was doing wonderfully. Those were the nurse's words. The nurse came once a week, and when she was in the house, the baby somehow seemed to know it, seemed to put on her best show, her quiet gaze, her gorgeous yawn, her delicate, almost fey little squirm in your arms. The nurse said she was strong, she was healthy, she was growing at exactly the right rate, that the formula seemed to be suiting her, although it would be even better, of course, if the milk could be coming from Mom. I have to go back to work in a month, said Joanne, once again. She had told the nurse this already. She had told her several times. She had told her mother too, and Mark's mother in the nursing hall street. Everybody seemed to be very concerned about the benefits of breastfeeding. Everybody seemed to think that surely something could be done about the terrible shortness of Joanne's maternity leave. Everybody had a solution, but nobody, as far as Joanne could see, had breasts throbbing and leaking with milk, and nobody had case files building up on a desk in Ormond Quay. She knew that the work she had to do was mounting, that her bosses had not hired anyone to replace her during her leave. For the sake of less than 2 months, they said, it would not have been worth their while. Joanne had worked in the office until the weekend before the birth. The narrow stairs with the rickety steps made sure that she started and finished each long, grinding day with the awareness of how responsible she was for the life curled up inside her beneath a layer of skin. Mark's mother had lost a baby at the bottom of the staircase, she had told Joanne. She would not wish the pain or the shock or the guilt of it on anyone, she had said. This had been while Joanne was growing bigger, growing slower, around the 8-month mark. His mother had been full of the kind of advice which had made Joanne wary of even stepping outside the door, about Mark's mother and Joanne's mother, the nurse was asking, about how far away they lived, about the great help they must be, about what a godsend they would prove to be in the months ahead. As she spoke, the nurse lifted one and then the other of the baby's legs, pulling each one gently, as if to stretch it out. What was that for? Was that meant to be some method for encouraging limbs to grow? Much of what the nurse did on her visit seemed mysterious. There was a lot of pressing and listening, tapping and weighing, and there was very little of the nurse telling them the things they had to do. They never felt, after one of her visits, that they were any closer to knowing what the trick to all of this might be. "You'll need your mom on the other end of the phone when this mom goes back to work," the nurse said to Mark. "Yeah," said Mark, in a tone as close as he could manage to the sheepishness that he felt sure the nurse wanted to hear. But he didn't want to sound sheepish. He resented feeling as though he had to. And if she said "mom" in that mid-Atlantic twang one more time, he would snatch Aoife right out of her arms. "Oh, it'll be a right lamb for your daddy," the nurse said to Aoife, dipping her low so that her gaze roamed around the room. "But he'll get used to it, won't he? He'll just have to, won't he, pet?" Beside him, Joanne sighed. He looked at her. She looked away. She was sighing not out of irritation at what the nurse was saying about him, he knew, but out of misery at what she was reminding them of, the fact that very shortly Joanne would be going back to work. This was not something Joanne wanted to talk about. Every time Mark tried to bring up the subject, she started to cry. She seemed unable to bear the idea of returning to the office and of being away from Aoife, and of starting up again with the 12-hour days of slaving Owen and Imelda, and of coming back in the evenings at a time when the baby would long since have gone down. He could understand it. The truth was, he would have hated to leave the baby too, even for a day. But how he was going to manage by himself was something he could barely imagine. He could give Joanne a run for her money when it came to anxiety and paranoia. The things that could go wrong, the damage he could accidentally do, the things that it could take you ages to spot, by then it would be too late. And the madness, the slow, creeping madness. He could feel it already quite firmly beginning to take hold. It was sleep deprivation, he knew that. It was also the lack of what used to be reality. Adult conversation, meaningless diversion, normal, everyday crap. He missed it. No, that wasn't true. He didn't have time to miss it. He could barely even remember it. But he was going demented without it. He was a worker at conveyor belts. He was a horse with 1,000 acres to plough. He was a rat in a lab. "You are a useless, self-pitying fucking arsehole, and I wish to God I'd never set eyes on you." That was Joanne's take on what it was. It was not constant, this perspective of hers. It was not always that she felt this way, but it seemed to be most of the time. She was just tired, he knew. What was the word? Harried? He thought so, but that word seemed tied to harridan, which was something he knew was absolutely not to call her. Jesus, if it wasn't tempting sometimes. She was still sore, he was aware of that, and she was shattered, and she was as scared of the baby as she was infatuated with her. And Mark knew from what he was feeling himself how these states of mind fed on and compounded each other, how the fear rendered the adoration the most terrifying thing you could feel, how the adoration warped and whittled the fear. You were afraid, half of the time, even to move. In the hours after Aoife was born, they were both dazed, struck incoherent and disbelieving as though by a sudden loss rather than gain. They had sat together on a bed in Hall Street, the plastic curtain drawn around the tiny space that had become charged with the shock of their now being three. Mark on the edge of a mattress, Joanne, flushed and wet hair, propped up against the pillows, and the baby. For over a day, the baby without a name. Then Aoife Lishna Casey, named after nobody, named for nobody but herself. Aoife came to them at 6 in the morning. She had spent a whole night in the struggle towards them, or away from them. Which was it? Which had she wanted? When they slopped her onto Joanne's chest, Mark had stared at her and tried to steel himself into feeling whatever it was he was supposed at that moment to be feeling. This being, this screaming thing, she was his. She was theirs. What were they supposed to do with her? What were they supposed to do for her? Were they supposed to show her how to live?